Good morning. We're calling to order the City of Santa Barbara Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan Subcommittee, November 4th, 2020. Can we start with a roll call?
Okay, here we go. Chair Sneddon.
Here.
Vice Chair Davis.
Here.
Member Friedman.
Here.
Member Jordan.
Here.
Member Sloan.
Here.
Member Schwartz.
Here.
Member Wiscombe.
Here.
Member Kramer. Member Longstreet. They will be in later. We have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Ms. Hetrick, do we have any announcements or agenda review?
Not on my end.
Okay, thank you. So for this meeting, we have much to cover. Melissa Hetrick has put together a presentation for us with gaps where there will be time for questions that we will go in order on the roster on our agenda of our names. You can, if you have questions at any time, those who are on the phone without a camera can just give us a verbal cue that you have a question or something to say. Otherwise, we will go in the order as listed on the agenda so that we can keep track of where we are. And I will hand it over now to Ms. Hetrick.
Thank you, Chair Sneddon. I want to thank you all for being present today. And as Chair Sneddon mentioned, we have a lot of topics to go through today. And never fear if we don't get through them in this meeting. We'll do it at next meeting. We'll just get through as much as we can. So next slide. So again, this is our agenda. We're going to go through our remaining discussion items from last meeting on the draft adaptation plan. There are 7 different topics there: modifications to guiding principles, the near-term action list, the priority of the near-term action list, the frequency of reevaluation of the plan, funding of projects, timing of large-scale flood protection measures, and then the role of the subcommittee moving forward. Next slide. And then if there's time and we get through all that, we'll begin to discuss what the subcommittee feels should be the components of a recommendation to council. And we'll discuss upcoming meetings. And this subcommittee traditionally does public comment at the end of the meeting. And so if anybody's here wants to comment, there'll be time at the end to do so. Next slide. All right, so diving right in, next slide. So last meeting, we had begun to talk about guiding principles, and those are included in your executive summaries, the hard copies that you should all have. And just a reminder that the guiding principles, the purpose of them is to assist in prioritization and planning for sea level rise moving forward, knowing that there's going to be a lot of competing resources and interest in different adaptation actions. The subcommittee last year, I guess, or 2 years ago, decided that we needed some guiding principles in order to prioritize projects. And so last meeting, we decided to add a principle that advocates for minimization of impacts to disadvantaged groups. Next slide. These are the additional modifications to the guiding principles that were brought up in public comments on the plan for this subcommittee to consider. The first is under guiding principle 2C. It currently reads, minimize impacts of sea level rise and related hazards to existing development. And there were comments that this should read to existing and future development. Oh, looks like I underlined the wrong words there. But the addition to this statement would be the words future and future. The second modification would be adding principles that emergency response and recovery coordination as well as greenhouse gas reductions are key aspects of sea level rise planning. We did get a number of comments, especially about the emergency response and coordination, that is really a key component of planning for sea level rise as a contingency. And in addition, there were a number of comments that we really need to be pairing this preparation for sea level rise with reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the third change that was brought up in public comments was adding to Principle 5, which is the principle that encourages different actions such as co-benefits, actions with co-benefits. So adding a principle there that reads, encourage voluntary and proactive resilience actions through incentives such as streamlining permitting. So this was brought up several times also by comments that we should really be looking at actions that not just things that the city would do or regulatory actions, but also ways to really encourage people to make their properties more resilient for the benefit of all. So with that, I believe we could probably go through and discuss all of them at once unless commissioners feel otherwise.
Do we want to go through a round of comments here? Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. Where does staff feel that the bullet point number 2 belongs, the emergency response and recovery coordination and greenhouse gas reductions? Where would you suggest that fit in?
I would probably suggest at this point that it be a new principle, that these are aspects that should be considered along with adaptation planning over time. It could either be there or in regard to co-benefits, although I think that doesn't really get at, I think, what the intent of the comments was, that these really are parallel efforts that are also very robust and not just a side project of the adaptation response.
So, okay, I don't have any problem with adding that as a new guiding principle, but it does need a verb. So, because we decided very early on that all of these, prioritize, minimize, design, ensure, and encourage are all verbs. So I just would like some guidance as to how to put this into, and perhaps some of my fellow committee members have some ideas on how to put this into a guiding principle that fits with the rest of them. And just as a comment, I have no problem with the other 2. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Are you saying about adding to Principle 5 with the voluntary? Is encourage not the verb? Encourage voluntary and proactive resilience, or is that a different?
I believe Commissioner Wiscombe was talking about the second bullet.
Okay.
That would be a whole new principle, and I think there could be different verbs there. Those are I can bring, these are mostly conceptual, and I can bring back wording, exact wording, but I think a number of verbs could be appropriate there that
It can come back.
yeah, I'll have to think about that. Commissioner Davis?
I'm just wondering whether it isn't part of number 5. We're talking about voluntary things, and we're talking about encouraging voluntary things by putting in incentives. I don't see why it doesn't just add on as a D. Because we're talking about voluntary, it's not mandatory. It's encouraging voluntary and proactive resilience through incentives. So again, I could just see it fitting in as item D under 5.
Vice Chair Davis, we're talking about the one above that discusses,
Thank you.
sorry, that discusses emergency response and coordination. And
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
wanted, yeah, I wanted to know, I wanted some guidance from staff
got it,
on how to
got
put
it.
that into a guiding principle with the verb. That's, so it's the second one, just to be clear, the adding principles.
Got it. Sorry, my mistake.
I think there's some confusion. Yeah, I don't have any problem with 5D, encourage, and then D.
And Vice Chair Davis, did you have any other questions on this
No, I have
section?
I have no problem with the first one. The second one, I had it in my mind under 3, that it was design adaptation strategies that provide for emergency response, recovery, coordination, and reduction. That's why I had it, but you know, I'll go wherever. If it's a new one, it's great, but I could fit it under there easily.
That could work also.
I like it under 3. And then I had the question of, we were trying to keep it on a single page, and so just wordsmithing or whatever we need to do to keep that tight. Okay, we're ready for the next. Unless are there any other callers or people without video who had comment here? Okay, carry on.
Okay, and next slide.
Ms. Hetrick, did you want us to have our cameras on as a group or during presentation, just you presenting?
I think because we're mostly discussing this whole meeting, we could keep cameras on.
Okay, come on back and we'll keep Ms. Hetrick company while she's presenting. Thank you.
Then you can't check the election results during the meeting. So near-term actions. So comments, there were some of these we've already briefly discussed, but the changes proposed for near-term actions is to add a near-term action to study the potential of raised groundwater levels to spread contamination in soils and groundwater. There's already a near-term action studying groundwater effects to groundwater in general, so really we would just be adding to that one. The concern here was about the amount of fill and small contamination that is in that lower downtown El Estero area. And in addition, the groundwater contamination that exists north of Highway 101, and the issue of rising seas potentially changing the dynamics of how that contamination could spread. And so that would go well with another study, with the study we're already projected to need regarding changes to groundwater. In addition, another action that's proposed to be added is, we've already discussed, is to study the potential socioeconomic impacts and benefits of various adaptation actions. Next slide. And then we also did receive several comments that the near-term action that currently reads that we should consider changes to floodplain regulations south of Highway 101 for new development and substantial redevelopment to make new development flood-proof to a higher elevation, factoring in sea level rise. There were several comments that the language there be strengthened from consider changes to change, so that we don't need to consider it, that we know we need to change it. So that is up for discussion. And then the other comments that came in were to add a near-term action to study incentives for raising or otherwise modifying structures and development to be more resilient voluntarily, and the types of things that were brought up in those type of comments were permit streamlining. Are there ways that we can make it easy for people to do resilient measures? And then the other comment that came up at Creeks Advisory Committee was that as we're looking, as we're studying the changes to rainfall patterns and how that might interact with sea level rise, that after that is done would be a really good time to reevaluate our creek setbacks and our design standards our bridges and other facilities around creeks to make sure that they are adequate. Commissioner Schwartz?
Thank you, Chair Sneddon and Ms. Hetrick. To the first bullet point, change floodplain regulations, and I'm sure that Vice Chair Davis can perhaps comment further from his expertise. Don't we need to do this in coordination with or even following FEMA mapping of our floodplain areas? I'm thinking of projects that have come to Planning Commission where we needed to follow the FEMA regulations very carefully in coordination with our local regulations. Can anyone comment on that?
Sure, Commissioner Schwartz. So right now, FEMA flood maps only factor in existing flood hazards. They don't factor, the regulatory maps do not factor in any changes that could be projected due to sea level rise. And so our floodplain regulations are based around the FEMA maps, and they do require flood proofing above the base flood elevation. It depends on the type of structure, either 1 foot or 2 feet. And so right now, north of Highway 101, where we're projected to see flood depths kind of similar to what we experience now, but just in different frequency, our floodplain regulations are potentially adequate. But south of Highway 101 with sea level rise, we are looking at flood depths that could be much deeper than those projected by the FEMA maps. And so the purpose of this action item is to consider changes to the floodplain regulations. And it's not that we would move away from FEMA, it would be in addition to the FEMA regulations. Essentially, do we need to be floodproofing, 3 feet above base flood elevation and or more or less. So we probably would still structure it around the quote base flood elevations that are shown in the FEMA maps. What other jurisdictions are doing are choosing a number that it has to be above that to factor in sea level rise, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And Ms. Hetrick, then just to follow on that, do we know for certain that FEMA is not undertaking some new policy considerations pertaining to sea level rise? Have we reached out to a FEMA representative on that?
Commissioner Schwartz, yes, we have. At this time, FEMA has informational maps associated with sea level rise, but all the regulations and regulatory aspects of it and floodplain program is based on current conditions, and that is that direction has not changed from the federal government. That could change in the future, but as it stands now, there is not a change yet on that.
Okay, if I could, one more question to the last bullet, adds study potential changes to creek setbacks. Do we have language, if not on this slide and on this bullet, elsewhere that references a balancing of our policies? We talk a lot about balancing policies at Planning Commission, and I know at Council as well, Chair Sneddon. And so it's the balancing here, for example, of our environmental protections with also other general plan policies and goals such as housing development, and how do we blend these together and balance them? Do we have that kind of language of balancing somewhere in our changes to near term or even longer term relative to reconsideration of creek setbacks?
Commissioner Schwartz, in the document right now, we actually don't have any language regarding reevaluation of creek setbacks. So this was a good comment by the Creeks Advisory Committee. So we can really frame it however we want at this point. So I can certainly direct ESA to put in language regarding the balancing aspect of that undertaking.
Okay. Well, I would just offer to our subcommittee that we consider balancing, and whatever terminology might be most agreeable to the committee members. Thank you.
Commissioner Schwartz, to that point, we can save for discussion too, but I would be a little bit hesitant to sort of predetermine how the balancing happens, and out of this adaptation plan might come what we would do, and then leave it to the Planning Commission, to the council to balance those out. And for this near-term action would be to study the potential changes to creek setbacks, which I think is in part of that study would be the balancing of that. But just my thoughts. So we have a lot of, for these comments, let's go in order. Commissioner Davis, Vice Chair Davis.
Thank you, Chair Sned. On the first item, again, just picking up on what you just said, this is changing consider to actually saying change, and you're making a predetermined determination that you want to change it. So I basically would leave it as it is on that particular item. And any other two, I don't have any problem with.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am, based on the discussion, I concur with Mr. Davis and yourself, Chair, that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And on the only thing I thought, but then on the discussion, I'm open either way, was it came up that FEMA is still the base. So what we would be doing was looking at enhancing it, but I guess we could look at that later. I just want to make it clear that that this needs to be clear that we're not going to try to change FEMA on our own, but enhance it. But there might be some areas where you might not, but it's less likely. So we can either change it or put something like enhance floodplain regulations beyond FEMA or something like that. But if we want to leave it, I'm fine with that. And I'm good with the other two.
Thank you. And as a reminder too, there's another slide that has more near-term changes that we'll further discuss. Councilmember Jordan?
Good to go with all these, Madam Chair, as discussed. What's going to be really interesting to me after hanging around water all my whatever life is that the creek setback issue is going to be more contingent on water coming backwards up watersheds now rather than coming down. And it's kind of just interesting to look forward to seeing how that all works out in the planning. So looking forward to that part just as an exercise.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, the only comment I might have is on that first one, that consider changes to change floodplain. I know we had this discussion early on that we're consistent with other things in the near-term actions that might have the word consider in it as well. I don't have the plan in front of me, so I don't know if there are any others, but if we're going to change them all to, rather than considering action, to talk about the action, then we should probably look at being consistent there. Melissa, do you remember that when we talked about that, or what we talked about?
Commissioner Sloan, I would say that most of the actions don't have the word consider. I think the reason it was phrased that way originally when we discussed this item was there's a lot involved in changing floodplain regulations. It can affect height limits and design and other things. And so I think there was just concern by a desire by the subcommittee to make sure we do study it closely before doing it.
So maybe on that, since it's been brought up a couple of times about FEMA, maybe we say change floodplain regulations in conjunction with the FEMA guidelines or something. I mean, so that we clarify that to Mike's point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Vice Chair Davis, did you have a comment to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I took this to basically be to look at what essentially is going to happen under sea level rise, and FEMA may or may not consider that. And this was basically to look at what the effects might be and to consider whether we wanted to enhance something beyond FEMA. So I don't think that it is consistent with FEMA. This is actually to look at doing something possibly beyond FEMA, but to be determined.
Okay, yeah, just some reference to FEMA, since it was brought up as that being important and possibly a contentious issue, maybe not under the guidelines, but maybe some reference to them in some manner.
I think a way to resolve it might be that we'd want to, of course, meet FEMA we receive funding for projects and people receive funding for meeting FEMA base flood elevation. So we wouldn't get rid of our FEMA regulations. It would be either adding on or a parallel effort. So maybe I can come up with language that essentially speaks to that, if that works.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And then,
That's it for me. I'm sorry, I was just saying.
okay. And Commissioner Kramer, did you have questions or comments on this section? I think you're muted still.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Well, welcome. We're happy to see you. Okay. And Commissioner Longstreet, do we have her on the line?
Chair Sneddon, we don't currently.
Okay, thank you. And then Commissioner Schwartz, did you have a further comment here?
Just following my questions, thank you, Chair Sneddon. I would support, consider, if that's what I heard Vice Chair Davis recommending. I think that's the appropriate orientation and path forward with respect to floodplain regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Wiscombe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support Vice Chair Davis's comments on the first one. FEMA, to me, I don't know why we'd have to have a reference to FEMA, because that, as Ms. Hetrick says, they're not, right now, they're not factoring in sea level rise, number one. And number two, these are more stringent regulations more stringent floodplain regulations that deal with the city of Santa Barbara. So it beyond and above FEMA. So I think consider changes to floodplain regulations is fine. And I don't have any problem with the other two. I appreciated Councilmember Jordan's comments about how we might be going the other way with sea level rise in terms of our creeks. So I think study potential changes to creek setbacks is totally appropriate at this point. And I don't have any problem with the middle one. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll just round out those comments. So I agree also with the first one, staying as considered changes, and the second one, good with, and the third one, I would leave that as study potential. I would add study potential changes to creek setbacks, and then we can look at far later, once that's done, what that means with balancing out with everything else. Okay. And back to you, Ms. Hetrick. You're muted.
Thank you. Mr. Bolton, if we could just go back a slide. I believe that we've spoken about both of these, but just checking in to make sure there's no further comments about these two changes to the groundwater and socioeconomic impacts.
Are there any comments on this item? If there are none, then I think we can assume that those are, approved.
Okay. Next slide, Mr. Bolton, thank you. So we discussed at last meeting, there were several comments that came in from different commissions in particular that, as you'll recall, we have about, I think something like 50 near-term action measures, and about half of those are labeled as high priority for the next 5 years, and then the rest are additional actions. And so one of the comments that we heard a lot is, this was great that we did this first level priority, but what are the 2 to 3 or few projects that we should really be right out of the gate trying to get funding for and trying to get done, and wanting really a focus on just a few things. And so the question to the subcommittee is, do we want to identify a kind of short list? And if we do, the short list that ESA would recommend is on the slide. So let me just go through that. Development of the shoreline monitoring program, ESA feels that's the cornerstone of implementation, and that the sooner we can get recording on baseline information at a minimum is important. Raising the harbor breakwater and groins, mostly because that is so crucial for protection of a lot of the waterfront and downtown area, and in addition could take a long time to get funded, studied, and done. The redesign of the Laguna tide gate, mostly because the tide gates aren't functioning now correctly, although if interim repairs are done that make it so they function better with a few inches of sea level rise, perhaps we don't need to do the full redesign now, but at least something needs to be done soon. Relocation or floodproofing the wastewater infrastructure under the beach. That we update the hazard mitigation plan, and the main purpose of that is the hazard mitigation plan is an avenue for us to receive funding through the FEMA hazard mitigation program, and so that really is a key to funding all of our other projects. And then ESA does feel that in the short term, studying how we might be able to optimize and expand our sand management will be key to responding to near-term events. So with that, I will bring it to the subcommittee for discussion.
Thank you. And I think for this, we'll go in order on the roster. A quick question first. Are there cost estimates associated with each of these when we make these highest priority actions? It might be good to know how big that ticket price is.
Chair Sneddon, there are not right now exact cost numbers on these. I think in general, a lot depends on how things are done. For instance, with the redesign of the Laguna tide gate, a lot of that depends on what is proposed, ends up being proposed for that. Some things are not that much money at all. Updating the hazard mitigation plan. We just scoped out the shoreline monitoring program to development of that to be about $100,000, including staff time. Raising the harbor breakwater and groins, I don't have exact number on that. And
I think for future, just order of magnitude, because if there are some that are relatively inexpensive and are high priority, well, then those seem easier to push forward. So just for future, it's good to have it, just order of magnitude.
So Chair Sneddon, I would just say a lot of these would start with a study. So the breakwater and groins, that would start with a study of how to effectively do that. Same thing with Laguna tide gate. Same thing with how to relocate our flood-proof wastewater infrastructure. We first need to study it to find out what our options are. And same thing with the last one, study optimization and expansion. And so the initial studies are not likely to be the big cost item. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Vice Chair Davis?
I like it. I like this high priority item. I like the fact of monitoring. That's got to be a priority. Critical infrastructure is that next group, and essentially what we identified there, harbor, tide gate, wastewater. Basically, they are the three highest priorities. And then the last two, in terms of hazardous mitigation and sand study, is essentially mitigation, what immediate mitigations we can look at. So I'm good with adding these as a highest priority.
Excellent, thank you. And Councilmember Friedman?
Thank you. I think these are where we need to be. The only one I throw it out there to consider as an extra, as one last one for highest priority, is to include Stearns Wharf and the harbor, docks, and city pier. Those three, chiefly because right now at times Stearns Wharf is already threatened at the current level. And if you add by 10 years from now projections of 0.8, I can going by triggers, but say it is another 0.8, we're going to have more issues in all of our boats that are on the docks down there, there's already those issues. And so if we wait to study it, and then it would take a number of years to go through it, because I remember back on the Harbor Commission, it took a few years to go through and redo the electricity on all the docks, let alone raising them. So I'd like to add at least studying, if that's what it takes, Stearns Wharf, the Harbor Docks, and City Pier as part of the critical infrastructure.
Thank you. And Councilmember Jordan?
Yeah, Madam Chair. I agree. I also agree with Eric. And then I would just caution people who want to go down the rabbit hole of trying to manage priorities from years of wrangling with Public Works at their every year or two phone book of capital projects, is that this list always changes based on the availability of grants and how you can get to money and the timeline of money. So even stuff that's not on this list may rise to the list because of available money all of a sudden, and stuff that's on this list may be years or decades out, and even though it's the highest priority. So I pretty much agree with all this, but I also acknowledge that staff really makes those calls on how this stuff flows based on what can be done, where the money's coming from, and how quick it can be gained. Thanks.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, I agree with what Eric was saying, that I think the Stearns Wharf should be on here, and the rest of the harbor infrastructure. The one comment I might make is where it says relocate or flood-proof wastewater infrastructure under beach. Don't we want to do that for all of the wastewater infrastructure, not just the pipes under the beach? Because doesn't the wastewater plant also, that's going to be impacted fairly recently if we don't do something? Maybe Dave can weigh in on that.
Vice Chair Davis?
Chair Sneddon, Mr. Sloan, the wastewater treatment plant, that's actually midterm. It's not in the near term. So I don't think there are any actions for the wastewater treatment plant until the midterm. So again, I'm just looking at the near term actions here, and the immediate near term action is to protect from the rising groundwater, the pipes in the ground down at the beach. We're good with that.
Yeah, you're more versed on that than I am, so I'm good with that. So that's my comments. Thanks.
Commissioner Sloan, just to add in, there is a near-term action item to study long-term, mid and long-term options for the wastewater system. That really is going to be a bigger study of how the system in general might be changed. That and that was intentionally separated out from this movement of the sewer mains under the beach, because the sewer main problem is, it's more of a discrete problem that is very near term, as opposed to studying the mid and long-term options. So we still have a near-term action of studying mid and long-term options, but this is really more of a do. We need to do this soon.
Yeah, I was just kind of keeping with the thinking that we list the monitoring first, and then we list some of the critical infrastructure next. And with Stearns Wharf in there, then shortly thereafter we start having to talk about the wastewater treatment plant. So that's all.
Thank you. And Commissioner Kramer?
Yeah, hi. I was going to say exactly what Eric said about the Stearns Wharf, so I won't repeat it, but also to consider issues about the yacht club and the facilities on that part of the harbor, which are already affected when there are high tides, especially king tides. It seems not to be mentioned anywhere here. But if the harbor breakwater increase is going to be an effect on that and on the yacht club, for instance.
Thank you for that. And we have Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Chair Sneddon. I think that this list of 6 is the right list for highest priority, but I want to touch on and agree with Council Member Jordan, and I'm recalling year upon year, he and I together on Planning Commission pressed for prioritization of capital improvement projects, which means sort of an iterative, continual recalibration on many levels of what our priorities should be. So I would just hope that this isn't what I'll call a static list, and that there's a kind of a refresher or review of the high priority list, both in terms of environmental threats, that is sea level rise threats, coupled with available, probably mostly state and federal funding opportunities, because I think we're going to have to be very aggressive. I say, of course, staff, it's going to be on staff to go after these grants. But sort of, again, bringing together our high priority list with available government funding. Otherwise, they can remain on a high priority list, but not be actualized or not be achievable without the proper funding. So somehow bringing that together, but otherwise, this is the right list, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. And then it looks like Vice Chair Davis had a comment to that, and then we have Commissioner Wickham.
It's more of just a question, and that is when we look at the 5-year plan, and it is really the staff, when we look at the 5-year plan and constantly looking what's going, we're going to be considering what Commissioner Schwartz just was outlined, I would assume, correct?
Vice Chair Davis, yes. And it's really, I can make sure that we frame it, any type of prioritization as such. Right now, the way it's written up is, hey, this is what we've identified right now, but this could certainly change based on conditions, funding, other aspects. So yeah, it's very much written up right now that this is our first thoughts now, but this is going to be continually being updated and changed.
And when we get to the place of talking about how often we update and all that, we'll have further discussion in that regard, I hope.
Thank you. And then Commissioner Wickham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree. I think these 6 are the highest priority. As Commissioner Davis said, this is critical infrastructure here, and that could be affected. So I think we have the right list. I appreciate that. The only additional comment that I would make would be probably under shoreline monitoring program. I would love to see a continue and expand public education component to that, just because I think we want to keep this in the forefront of the community. So, and you know, the monitoring program will be ongoing, and that's probably the place to put that. But if all of these items here will require study, they'll have public input, and I think a continued education component is really essential on the list. Thank you.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think keeping the public engaged, and this is now our future of what we'll be continually dealing with, and the iterative priority list reorganization, and I completely agree with that. I also think that this is the right list. And I think a consideration of Councilmember Friedman and Commissioner Kramer's other priorities throughout the harbor area, I think it goes in there as well, but maybe not, well, in there as well, but not as high as the breakwater and the groin. So I think those are near-term actions that have to be looked at because they'll be affected in the near term. So I would agree with adding those in, or maybe a generalized comment about that the harbor area there. Vice Chair Davis, yes.
Thank you, Chair Snedden. In the actions under the harbor, under the highest priority for the next 5 years, there are additional actions, and it's basically set that a ½ a foot of sea level rise, start planning for the protection of all of those other facilities. So we do have it covered. And I guess the question is, are we moving it up into the highest priority of the next 5 years, or are we tying it to the actual sea level rise proposed in the plan today?
Councilmember Friedman?
The only reason I actually went back, it's like everyone went back and forth on this, but for me, it comes down to that, especially Stearns Wharf and the docks themselves, that they're already experiencing impacts. Stearns Wharf, we know it's on a high tide. We've had some damage in the last few years. So I felt that planning for it now, moving it up so that we have the plans in place of what we want to do with them. So in 5 years from now, we can actually make those investments rather than planning 5 years from now. And what really caught my attention was it's page ES21 in the plan, was it kind of lists by 0.8 feet, which is what we're projecting by 2030. Again, there's triggers in there. So I'd like to include it, but I think to Council Chair Sneddon's remarks, it's not as high as the harbor breakwater and groins, because that's the big one. But I think we should include it, or at least start planning for it, because they're already experiencing damage, at least Stearns Wharf.
Should we
So
include
how
a
we wanna
study
do
of it in the next 5 years, that it's the study and the plan?
Was it within the next 5 years, or was it with, what's the actual language? I don't.
Right. If you
The
actually
highest
go to,
priority, yeah.
if you go to ES26, right, and you have this at 5 foot sea level start planning, you could just take out the sea level and say start planning, which essentially starts today. Okay, so if you took out, you've just the trigger, it has the planning in there. Yeah, you got it on the screen there. You look under the white, it's the second bullet under the high priority for the harbor. Just take out the 0.5 sea level rise and it's starting planning, and it's essentially in the near term.
There we go. That's perfect. That's all we need to do. I guess that's where I didn't want to wait for it to get to a certain level. So that's it. I think that's a great, very eloquent solution to it. Perfect.
Thank you. And I do think it might help to have a little wording in that high priority list so that people know that it is happening now. I think that's one of the first things people will say is, what about Stearns Wharf and what about the city docks? And they'll think that we haven't looked at it or are not prioritizing it. And I think a reference to that would be helpful.
So just as a
Wisdom, did you
note,
have?
oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I was just going to note that in the analysis of the harbor, it is important that as we are improving the marinas in phases, that we need to be raising them, and that is a more immediate need. Stearns Wharf, really the concern is more in the near term. When will we have to start closing the wharf during storm events? And that is more of a near-term issue than I'm not sure that it's actually a near-term issue that we need to actually redesign the wharf or consider removal. And then with regard to the harbor commercial area, I think as Councilmember Friedman mentioned, that is already a concern. And so so I think that we could develop something around kind of the whole harbor area as being kind of like a frontline area, if that makes sense.
I think that sounds good. And Commissioner Wiscombe, did you have a final comment there?
No, Madam Chair.
Oh, okay, thank you. I thought I saw you raise. Okay, back to you, Ms. Hetrick.
Okay, so are there any more comments on this priority list, or are we complete with this? Okay. So next slide, thanks. So there was much discussion either way, comments either way, on whether the recommendation in the current recommendation, the adaptation plan, reads that we should update the adaptation plan every 10 years. And so comments that were received either supported this or supported possible changes. And the two possible changes were that we change that to at least every 10 years or sooner if warranted due to a significant new information. And then there was also recommendations that we change it to every 5 years. So with regard to this item, the issues that were brought up are that number one, that OPC in the state is planning to update their sea level rise projections every 5 years. I will tell you, I have spoken to OPC recently about this, and that really is not, it's not a written requirement that they do that. It's just their goal. And so they are trying to reach that goal, but it's not for sure that that would happen. I think also playing into this is you need to remember that we will be consistently or continually updating the 5-year implementation plan as new information comes in, and part of the shoreline monitoring program will be looking at how projections change. So it's really a question of when do we want to reconsider the whole adaptation plan altogether, as opposed to, that doesn't mean that we won't be doing continual updates to the 5-year implementation plan. So with that, I'll hand it over to the subcommittee to discuss.
Thank you. And let's go in order again. Commissioner Davis?
I actually like at least every 10 years or sooner if warranted due to significant new information, recognizing that we're going to be basically looking at it every year. I think the focus in the near term ought to be on the implementation of the near term actions, and that's going to take a maximum city effort, maximum dollars, and to basically go back into a 2-year process of updating the plan after just 3 years. That's what you'd essentially be starting the study. Now, I'm good with the middle one, 10 years or sooner if warranted.
Thank you. And Councilmember Friedman?
I concur with everything that Mr. Davis just said. My strongest concern was you have a 5-year plan and it takes 2 years to update it, and so you're constantly changing. And then if the OPC doesn't, if we update our plan and then a year later they, instead of taking 5 years, they take 6, then what do we do at that point? So I concur that based on new information or significant changes, we should update it.
Thank you. And Councilmember Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm okay with that too. My concern really is just how long it takes to get a credible shared monitoring program up, because if that takes 5 years and then you're already 5 years out and waiting for your next 5 years or significant event, it just seems like to me that that's like so important to jump on, worry about baselines, worry about monitoring, and that will probably, the results of that or the review of the monitoring will drive that first bullet, the 10 years or sooner. So I'm okay with either of these, but I think the 10 years or sooner of warranted is the right phrasing. It's just important to start getting in place what would lead to looking at it being warranted. So the devil's in the details, of course. Thanks.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, I agree that 10 years or sooner is probably the best language there.
Thank you. Commissioner Kramer?
Yeah, I like the flexibility of 10 years or sooner if warranted. And maybe there could be an addition that there would be regular reports every 2 years, say, from the waterfront director as to what the situation is in the harbor generally.
I like that. Thank you. And Commissioner Schwartz?
Thank you, Chair Sneddon. I can support this, although I want to touch on what I heard from Councilmember Jordan, which really resonates with me. And I think we need to lean in and use our adaptive management tool that we've worked so hard over a number of years to create. And so I'm a little reluctant to support the at least every 10 years. I think we need to have a more continual process with shorter intervals, but I'll defer to the full committee or the majority of the committee members in terms of what they're comfortable with. But I think continual evaluation, continual bringing in best practice, current science, etc., federal agency information is going to be key. And right now it's hard to say what those intervals are. But I think we just don't want it to get away from us and then fall behind in terms of nimbly making these really critical decisions. So thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm quite comfortable with at least every 10 years or sooner. Commissioner Kramer's comment about the flexibility that it gives, I think is important. And I appreciated Commissioner Davis's comments to lead off the discussion. So I think it does give us the most flexibility, and I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll add, I think some of the issue I have here is the wording of reevaluation of the adaptation plan versus redoing the adaptation plan. And I think a 10-year increment can be in the acceleration of climate change and sea level rise that we're experiencing. It might just be too long. And to me, 10 years seems like too long to be reevaluating the plan. This is not saying redo the whole thing or start from scratch and redo all the studies, but I'm to Commissioner Schwartz's comments that this needs to be an iterative, looked at often and frequently and measured against what the reality is. And to Councilmember Jordan's comments that once we get the monitoring in place, we may have new information that shifts it in a different direction. And if we don't know that threshold ahead of time of when that would reopen looking at this, I mean, if warranted due to significant new information, I don't want there to be so much debate about, well, was that significant enough or not new enough? And, with current staff, I completely trust that you would bring forward something that was imminent, but we want to set something up in place that no matter who is on council or who is in different positions, that this will continue to get the needed attention. So I worry that 10 years is too long in the current acceleration to just reevaluate. And so maybe we could have it be that every 2 years we're reevaluating the priority list. And then if that priority list starts to get out of sync with what we know about new data and the adaptation plan, then we reopen the adaptation plan sooner. And I don't know if that collects all the comments here. It's a little bit different than that, but I just feel that 10 years is too long to be reevaluating the plan, not redoing the whole plan, but just, I think it should be in the constant measure, just like we do with the general plan. We keep measuring ourselves against it, but then we have this longer deadline. But this adaptation seems to warrant a closer time frame. Commissioner Vice Chair Davis.
Go to page ES 23 in the executive summary. We're talking about here the changes of conditions. This is the second paragraph under near-term actions, second sentence. Changing conditions and changes in best available science, new technologies, new funding, changes in community priority will necessitate regular reevaluation of appropriate adaptation strategies and potentially identification of new strategies. The adaptation strategy discussed section have been identified. Anyway, I took this to be that in that 5-year near-term implementation plan, we would be doing evaluation of where we're at and the effectiveness of the strategies. So I concur exactly with what you're saying, Chair Sneddon, that we need to basically be on top of what the changing conditions are, and they may be more radical. My personal thought, that was being wrapped into that 5-year implementation plan and constant evaluation and going to Commissioner Schwartz, adaptive management where necessary. So anyway, I could go with either way, but I think I took it was covered under that language.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're ready for the next section if there are no further comments. Do you have what you need on that, Ms. Hetrick?
Well, based on what I'm hearing, maybe there's something in between these two items to consider.
Chair Sneddon, why don't we let staff take that and come back? Because again, we're gonna meet again. Why don't you take what you have here and see what you can come back, which kind of melds in what you've heard. I think that would be helpful.
Excellent, thank you. Does that work for you? Okay,
yeah, I think everybody's kind of saying the similar thing. It's just a matter of how it's worded. So I will take that back and we can discuss it at the next meeting. So I just want to do a time check. It's 10:04. We end at 10:30. think we have time for the next item, but the item after that, discussing the large-scale flood protection measures, it's quite long. It's probably at least a 15 to 20-minute discussion. So why don't we discuss the next item about funding, and then move into public comment? Does that work, Chair Sneddon?
It does. Thank you, Ms. Hetrick. And to our last meeting, we knew we had a lot to discuss these next few meetings, and we want to be sure we have time for discussion. And so we'll just be adaptive in that way and shift things around. So thank you.
Okay. Mr. Bolton, next slide, please. So this was a discussion item raised by Commissioner Sloan, wanting to discuss as a subcommittee how we're going to go about identifying funding and prioritizing projects. So who will do that? How will it be done? Will it be department by department? Will it be centrally coordinated? And I want it to be a subcommittee discussion, but the way that staff at least has been thinking about it is there would be some kind of central coordination, likely out of, in the long term at least, out of the sustainability department, but that it is going to, there are going to be responsibilities of each department to get funding and scope out and prioritize their specific projects. They are the experts in their areas. And so I think the way that staff is at least envisioning it is that there's kind of a coordination happening in the sustainability department in the long term, but that really that position is helping to coordinate what's actually happening on the ground in multiple departments. And as far as funding, I think similarly, it could be similar, that we don't all need to be looking for funding related to sea level rise, but that it's a joint effort, and that the interdepartmental team continues to function as a team working on sea level rise. And so that's just conceptually how we've been thinking about it, but we're very open to a subcommittee discussion on this.
Thank you. And let's go in order here. Vice Chair Davis.
Yeah, I have no comments in that regard. I think what Ms. Hetrick just outlined basically is going to evolve and develop based upon budget and city organization as we go forward. Ultimately, council is going to make these decisions, and that to be determined as we go forward based upon funding and priorities of the day.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedman.
The only thing I have to add, well, two things, is when to get to Mr. Davis' point, when the council every year in our budget looks at our capital improvement program, I think Councilmember Jordan raised this earlier, is that's an opportunity for us as council to elevate these on a yearly basis. The other thing that we should be looking at as a council, and I'm not sure exactly how to do this, but would be to coordinate with other maybe local jurisdictions on advocating for state and federal dollars. I think we'd have more opportunity with the state. We could use our legislative committee to do that, but there might be other ways we can work with the South Coast in particular, with Beacon coming in together to try to do this, because we do have an opportunity with Beacon. It's a model the state is looking to, and we are unique because it's multi-jurisdictional, and that's where they're going. So really kind of working through that lens on what we might be able to look at for outside funding. So CIP and regional collaboration to lobby the state. So I think we can focus resources. And then I'm great with what Ms. Hetrick said about staff really focusing on priorities.
Thank you. And Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm good with staff's narrative, and also what I just heard from Mr. Davis and Mr. Friedman.
Thank you. Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah, I'm good with that also. Is there any way that what Melissa just said could be codified somehow, rather than just it will end up in the sustainability group sometime, or is there a plan for that, or is that just kind of the rumor on the street, or how do we address that?
So Commissioner Sloan, I think a lot comes down to budget discussions and dedicated staff resources for sea level rise coordination. It's a tough budget right now with the COVID situation and the hard hits to a lot of our income streams. And so I think the message I'm hearing from is that the long-term intent is to have a central coordination on sea level rise in the sustainability department. That said, the sustainability department right now is primarily devoted to climate action planning and energy and environmental services. And so there is a transition period now where with the COVID budget, it's a little unclear about how staff resources might be dedicated to that centralization. So I think that is an issue that council will need to consider further. Chair Sneddon, did you want to weigh in on that?
I do actually. I think it's really important that we make it part of our recommendation that this receive priority in funding. When we say with the sustainability department that right now is understaffed, even though we've approved more staffing and just created this department and want it to be more robust, but because of budget concerns. And if we have it in sustainability and it doesn't have the staffing or the funding, and we're not prioritizing that this needs to have funding paths, I do worry that it's not going to make its way in as a line item for the future and sustain funding through that. So I am comfortable, of course, that staff is very aggressive with going after funding. To Councilmember Freeman's points about looking at state and federal, I think absolutely we'll need to be doing all that. But I would like coming out of this subcommittee that we have the recommendation that we have this as a funding priority. It's not currently, and I don't know. We can leave it to the budget time, leave it to a current council to work it in. But I think I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, Commissioner Sloan, but to have it be codified that this is a priority, that this have funding, whether it's through individual departments or holistically, but that we're raising this up as something important for the city that has to be prioritized. That would be my preference, but yeah.
And that's kind of where I was headed with it, rather than just leave it up to everybody to go see what they can find, to actually make it a priority at the highest level, at council and through the city organization. One of the things I might suggest, and this touches on a little bit of what we discussed just a few minutes ago, is that some of these commissions that are touched by this, like the Harbor Commission, and I would even go as far as say the City Council, have this as a regular item that we review on either an annual basis or a biannual basis, where we actually have a report on where we stand on not only just the funding, but the whole sea level rise adaptation plan and how we're doing towards that. And that would get back to that, how often do we review the whole plan? And I think maybe if we added that to our calendars on a regular basis, it would keep the priority in front of us so that we know that we have to talk about it at least once a year, whenever the time is agreed to. So I might suggest that as well, to address not only this, but the previous item is how often do we review the plan?
And I will say that I really like that. And then if we're doing that also to the point very early on about tying this into greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, if the departments are giving updates regularly, as you're saying, every 2 years on what you're doing to address sea level rise, what your funding is, what you're doing to address sustainability, then those become sort of rolling priority lists. I think that's a great solution. But I think we got out of order here. And Commissioner Davis, and then we will go to Commissioner Kramer.
I agree with what's been said, so pass on.
Thank you.
I'll just, I really like what Commissioner Sloan just proposed. I think give it to staff, let them roll that in, how it could, all of that could be into the area where we talk about the review of the plan, that in fact we'll have that being reviewed by council in terms of every 2 years, and that the boards and committees which are affected report to the council in that review process. I really, really like that process. So Jim, good idea.
I agree. Thank you. And Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you. My thoughts are really a combination of what I heard from Councilmember Friedman and from you, Madam Chair. And I would also add that perhaps as a priority next step, staff could look into whether there's any government funding to secure additional staff resources in our long-range planning group under Dan Gullett, just as we've recently been successful in securing Senate Bill 2 grant funding for our long-range planning staff support to move forward with objective design standards planning for our entire city, which is required under state law. So we're not going to be able to do this work without proper staff resources. I suggest we make a priority to go get the funding to support the staff resources. Otherwise, we can continue for a subcommittee to work on these desires and ideals and goals. But if we don't have the staff support, we won't be able to make it happen. So that would be my additional thoughts. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And Commissioner Wiscombe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciated Councilmember Friedman's comments. I think the CIP is an opportunity at council to elevate the discussion and get this in front of them. And I also truly appreciate Commissioner Sloan's comments about regular review at council. I think that keeps the item up front and centrally focused. We have a fairly well-oiled machine in the city and interdepartmental cooperation. So I thought that Ms. Hetrick's approach was appropriate. I don't have any problem with that. I think this is going to hit quite a few departments, and they do work well together. So I'm okay with that. Let's see. And to Councilmember Friedman's coordination on a multi-jurisdictional level, I think that's also important to add and to stay on top of here, because that might really be our opportunity to gain increased funding for this. So, and I do think we need, perhaps a statement crafted by staff that addresses all of these things that we seem to agree on here. And Ms. Hetrick went, she did a good job at the approach, and then we added to it. So I think she can come back with something that really works for us. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to reiterate that I think it might be, I think it needs to be clear, and I think we've made it clear direction from this committee to have this be a funding priority, and staffing and funding for staffing support of implementing this. So that might not be something that staff feels that they could bring forward on their own. I want to make it very clear that we are directing that priority, and I think our comments here make that clear. And I have to just as a comment on this, I'm so proud of us on this subcommittee that we are unwavering in our support of this. It's just really encouraging every time we go around that how committed we are to this, and it's a good outcome. So just wanted to say that at this moment. And back to you, Ms. Hetrick.
Thank you, Chair Snedden. So I would just note that the CIP is reviewed and updated every 2 years, and project managers take it around to their respective board and commission. So tying into that process is could be a good option moving forward. So it's 10:20 right now. What I would suggest is that we move to public comment and then discuss the upcoming meetings after public comment. Does that work, Chair Snedden?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so if we have any members of the public who would like to make a public comment at this hearing, please use the raise your hand icon using your GoToWebinar control panel. It's a little confusing because red means raised and you only have to click it once. Currently see one hand raise, a Miss Allison Thompson. You're going to go ahead and have 2 minutes. I'm going to unmute you and then you'll need to unmute yourself. And once you get going, I'll get the timer going. So Miss Allison Thompson, you'll need to use the GoToWebinar control panel to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. Hello, Chair Sneddon and Commissioners. Thank you so much for all of the work that you have done on this. My name is Allison Thompson, and I am the Operations Coordinator and Policy Analyst at Heal the Ocean. I am speaking today just briefly that we really do recommend and encourage staff and commissioners to reevaluate the adaptation plan more frequently than every 10 years. We agree with comments we heard from Commissioner Schwartz and Sneddon. The conditions are changing too rapidly to not keep up with incoming science and recommendations from other agencies and federal news and data, and we truly do believe that it is critical for the safety of the city as well as for our public resources that we revisit the plan and at least reevaluate priority lists every 5 years and as frequently as data comes in. The projections are just projections. You know, science believes the ice will melt faster than we can even project, and things change rapidly. So it's critical that we remain flexible and that we revisit new information as frequently as it comes in. I know you are set to speak about this or going to discuss this again next meeting, so hopefully there can be some reevaluation and agreement on analyzing data more frequently and keeping up with new information. And that is our comment. So Heal the Ocean feels strongly for a reevaluation every 5 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Is there any other public comment?
Chair Sneddon, that is the only person with their hand raised, so I think we can go back to the subcommittee.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Hetrick.
So, Mr. Bolton, if you wouldn't mind bringing up the slide entitled Upcoming Meetings, I believe it's slide 24. So we have a meeting tentatively scheduled for November 18th, where we would go through any follow-up from today. So that the remaining items for discussion that I had that we didn't get through are taking another recap or taking a quick look at the timing of large-scale flood protection measures and making sure we're all aware of that timing. Discussing the role of the subcommittee moving forward, and then looking at components of a subcommittee recommendation, which we partially discussed today. So I think that is likely what we're going to put on the agenda for November 18th. And then we will be receiving, be working on the revised draft of the adaptation plan. And hopefully by December 2nd, we will have that for you and can be looking at the changes and considering a draft recommendation either December 2nd or December 9th. Does anybody have any comments on our upcoming meetings? Okay.
Is anyone on the phone? Councilmember Jordan? No, okay.
I'm good. If you're looking for me, I'm on video, but there's only 6 people that can be seen on video.
Oh, I thought we had changed that. We just had Mr.
Yeah,
Bolton, come on.
to the chair, and then yeah, we can actually have 25 cameras on now and go to webinar. That was upgraded a couple months ago now. They expanded some of the capabilities. So if you would like to put your webcam on, Mr. Jordan, feel free. If not, that's cool too. Thanks. Bye.
Ah, there we go. Hello.
I
So
did
any
just
other?
want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Bolton for coordinating these meetings. It is a very hard job, and also Ms. Gu for taking notes during the meeting.
Ms. Hetrick, I don't want to put you on the spot if you're not prepared, but is there anything that we should be thinking about for discussion about the future role of the subcommittee that we might want to think about ahead of time before we discuss it at our next meeting?
Sure, I can just tell you why that came up. Previously, the subcommittee had requested that one of the near-term action items be to retain the subcommittee through implementation. And I believe the comments that raised this as an item was just, are we basically going into implementation mode like we do with other projects where we don't necessarily have a subcommittee? Is the subcommittee just for this adaptation plan? Or is it something where we might want to consider that if, like in the long term, another department will be heading this effort, that a different committee might be recommended? So those are just comments that came up. And so that was a requested item for discussion by subcommittee members.
Thank you. So we'll just keep that in mind. We won't discuss it now, but for our next meeting to keep in mind how you think we might function if it's this committee or a different configuration, or if at all in the future. Thank you. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about before our next meeting?
I would be thinking about what you feel are the important components of a subcommittee recommendation. You'll see in our PowerPoint now what staff is considering, and I believe I went through this at the last meeting too, what staff is considering as part of our recommendation to council when we get there. We'd be looking at adoption of the adaptation plan, directing staff to begin implementation of the plan, including development of a 5-year implementation plan, and then initiation of an LCP amendment. But if there are other, so that's what staff is considering recommending to council. And so between now and November 18th, I would be thinking about anything beyond that or different from that the subcommittee really wants to emphasize in their recommendation. So that would be my direction on that.
Thank you. And then I suppose, since we're right close to ending time, if there are any other comments from any subcommittee members you'd like to make at this time. Vice Chair Davis?
I just want to compliment staff on the organization of getting us through these steps. Going into it, I was curious as to how we would handle this, and I just have been very impressed on how you've walked through it, and echoing your comments, Chair Snedden, proud of the committee basically on how we basically have come together at the end. So thank you to staff, and thank you to all the other committee members.
Thank you. And Councilmember Friedman?
Just real quickly for all of you, and we can have conversations later, but I was appointed as the vice chair of the League of Cities Coastal Cities Group, and so for the coming year. And one of the major efforts that the league in this group in particular is working with the Coastal Commission to look at a lot of these issues and how the Coastal Commission can and we can partner with them on a lot of these challenges. So glad to talk with any of you offline on some of the things I should be thinking about or should be advocating for as part of this effort. And today, actually, I think right now the Coastal Commission is looking at its strategic plan for the next 5 years as we're speaking right now. So if you have time or want to look at that document, it is available. And for today, thank you.
Congratulations and thank you, Councilmember Friedman. And are there any other closing comments on what we've discussed today? No? Okay, I believe with that then we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.